Okay, we make a beginning. Look, this is the first session of the Concepts on Chat workshop. The whole series is really just focusing on the concept. We're not really doing any psychology or child development as such. I get people very clear on the concepts that are being used, the concepts which are like the foundation of the theory. The theory is, of course, that of Vygotsky and his successors in activity theory. The first session, what we'll do today, will be particularly abstract. Right? The way I'm approaching things is I want to get the absolute foundations nice and solid, and then we can move up from there. By the time we get to the end of the 5-week course, we'll be dealing with very concrete concepts which you will relate to not only in your professional lives but in everyday lives as well. But where we're starting from is going to be somewhat abstract, so I ask for your forbearance in that. Better to get these very fundamental issues sorted first, then you can move on without getting into confusion. So I thought what I'm going to do to start with is I'm going to look into the question of mind and matter. Now, Russell, you can help me out here. You see those shapes there? Can you tell me, and everyone else is thinking about this as well, are they the same shape or are they a shape and its mirror image?
The same shape flipped, maybe?
I think it's the mirror.
So you think it's a mirror image? Okay, how did you do it?
Just, I did it at home actually.
That's okay. Explain.
I just flipped it and rotated.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the right answer. They're mirror images of each other. But those shapes that you rotated, and you showed me with your hands how you did it, are they material things?
Well, I read your paper.
Yeah, you read the paper good. We'll out with it. And we'll see if anyone disagrees. What do you think?
Which I think, yes.
They're material things. Anyone disagree? So we all think that. So Adriana, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. When Adriana mentally rotated these shapes in her head, they were material things. They're subject to the laws of gravity, radiation, they reflect light, they have a weight, size.
It was a mental image that she rotated in her mind, or a material object that she actually...
That's right. So it wasn't a material, it was a mental image, but Adriana's unhappy with saying that because she knows she's a material being herself, and whatever went on inside her must have had something to do with the material world. Does that fairly represent the hesitation? Maybe not, no. Okay, now...
I thought more because I'm reading the letters at the moment.
Yes. When you're too far into it, the questions are no longer simple. You can't give naive answers. That's right. You've got to think about it.
That was
Russell.
reading for this week, was it?
Sorry?
Just double check. Was that reading this week?
No, wasn't on the reading list at all. I surprised you with it.
Missed something.
No, I surprised you with it. That some people were smart and were following academia.edu.
I got it in an email.
Right.
Today.
Yeah. But I didn't set it for the reading. But because I wanted to be absolutely, completely, 100% clear on this question myself when I fronted you, I spent some time and actually wrote it up in a paper. And I stuck it on academia.edu, and some people spotted it and had a read, which is good. Okay, now, your name was? Jean. Sorry, Jean. Jean says that they're not material. Those objects which Adriana was rotating in her mind are not material objects. Yeah. That seems fair enough?
They can be a representation of a material object.
Yeah, but in actual fact, they don't even exist, those shapes. If they do, it's purely coincidental.
Yeah.
So they're utterly figments of the imagination. They don't relate to any real thing at all. Though, if I looked at that and I mentally rotate that, it's the same thing. It doesn't matter whether the object exists, or in the first place is imaginary. What I rotate in my mind is imaginary. Okay, so the point I want to make is Adriana's first sort of suggestion that they're material. I mean, if they are material, what's not material? Right? If I were to have an argument with someone, and there are plenty of people who insist that those shapes are material, what is not material? Can anyone suggest how someone might respond to that, even though you don't agree with it? I mean, what is not material in this world?
I think
Yes.
certain areas of mathematics that are like impossible could never be material.
Well, I disagree with you there. I think that if you can write some symbols and put them on paper, they're material, and that they're representing things, and even if those relations are themselves impossible, they're still things for you to apprehend with your senses and think about, and if you died, they'd still be there. Right? And that's a good test. If they still exist after you die, then there's something more to them than a figment of your imagination. Right? So the whole question of mind versus matter, or consciousness versus matter, is actually a relational question. It comes to us and it's reflected in our language that something is either this or that. It's actually a relational thing. That you have to know the difference between, like I had a dream this morning that I had to be here at 10 a.m. and I noticed it was 10 a.m. and I started rushing off and got involved in some sort of Dickensian London issue, desperately running late. I woke up, it was 10 a.m, but I knew I didn't have to be here till 6. That was not real, it was not material, it was an illusion. And it was an illusion that had very little basis in fact. Had some basis in fact, I did have to be here, I got the time wrong. Right? So you have to know the difference between something that's in your mind and what's outside your mind. Everything outside your mind is material. Right? It's not a meaningless word, because what's not material is the things that you just have in your imagination. Now, let's say what Adriana has in her imagination, from my point of view, that's a material thing. So, for example, if someone has it in their mind that I'm out to kill them, that may be an illusion, but it's a very material thing as far as I'm concerned. I have to allow for it. I say, where did they get that idea from? What am I going to do to escape their unpredictable and dangerous behaviour? But it's a relational thing. The relationship between mind and matter isn't a relationship between two substances. It's a relationship between what's in your head and what's not in your head but outside there. And mathematics is just as material as any of the other branches of natural science. Let's say what it studies and its activity. Yes, Gavin?
So perception is reality is material.
Look, perception is perception. The process of perception is carried out by a real human being, and it's a material process. But I have to know the difference between my thoughts about something, or my images I form of it, and the world. So my perception is not reality in that sense. But someone else's perception is a reality. It's outside of me, I have to allow for it, I have to understand where it comes from. So for example, if someone comes and beats me up, and then the police come along, put them on trial, they can be found guilty, right? And people don't blame me, you know? But from my point of view, I don't care whether he's guilty or not, I'm going to get myself out of the way of that person, right? So sort of, that's a relational question as well. So when you say, it's people responsible for themselves, well, that's a useless thing to say about the world in general. The world is governed by social inequality, social forces, ideology. There's cause and effect going on there. But when I think about my own behaviour, it's no good me saying I had a lousy childhood, I'm going to behave badly. As my own behaviour, which I know only through my own consciousness, that's something different. Right? That's the distinction. It's the distinction between what's in your own mind and the rest of the world. That's what the mind-matter distinction is, and it's actually very widespread. It goes to moral questions as well. Okay, so I wanted to get that out of the road. It really bears very little relation to what we're going to do here, but confusion about mind and matter can lead to funny ideas. For example, if I have an idea, I see Russell sitting there, I don't see a lot of neurons buzzing around and zapping. It may be that those neurons were something to do with me seeing Russell sitting there, but when I look at him, I see something that's a couple of metres away from me, not the insides of my head. So there is a distinction. Now what I'm going to do is go back to our course. Alt-Tab should get it there, right? And we're going to make a start. So I wanted to get that mind and matter thing out of the way. Understand? I'm sure it's not completely clear because you have to keep coming back to this, and by all means doing this little article which you'll find on the PowerPoint is a way of rehearsing. Yes?
I had the issue of materialism, the issue about whether things are material or not described to me in quite a helpful way. Someone said, poverty is not, is something that exists.
That's right.
It's material
yes.
in nature, but actually it's not something, it's one of those things you can't really, I can't remember exactly how they put it, but I thought it was quite a good explanation for me to be able to understand.
Okay, there are a lot of arguments about poverty, for instance, related to setting the poverty line.
Right.
Whereby, for instance, a poor gentleman in India will lie down after a hard day's work on straw with concrete underneath, and because he's got the straw, he's actually very happy. And because yesterday he didn't have a straw, someone gave him some, he doesn't feel poor.
Yeah.
Okay, but the fact is he is poor. That's subjective. Yeah. Right? How do you establish that? It's very complex. Right? The question of the reality of poverty and compared to measurements and perceptions of it and so on. I mean, there are whole universities that sweat over this issue, right? It's a complex scientific question. But poverty itself is a material reality. It's out there and it will still be there when you die. How you conceive it, that's a problem of knowledge. A problem of existence and a problem of knowledge, two different issues. Now, the way Vygotsky approached consciousness is by this definition. He says it's what mediates between different processes. It's a mediating thing. I'm going to sharpen the definition up. I'm going to say it's what mediates between our physiology and our behaviour. Now we have all sorts of nervous activity going on in our body and different sort of physiological things happening inside us, and you cannot stick some kind of fancy microscope into someone's head and see their thoughts. Right? The thoughts are subjective processes. What you can see is their behaviour. Now, I can, for instance, be feeling a lot of fear, anxiety. I don't know what's driving that fear. But I can think about it. I think, why am I feeling this way? Whether I start running away or whether I start shaking or keep a cool exterior, that's to be decided. The consciousness is what I'm going through in handling and managing my behaviour, given all the things that are going on inside my body, all the different sensations and feelings and so on. Right? So I put that little asterisk there, little star in consciousness, because that's where you're looking from. Yeah, when you're looking at the world, you're a conscious being, and you can't look at your own physiology of thinking and your own behaviour. That's for someone else to do, to look at your behaviour or study your physiology, because you're really part of that. Your consciousness is mediating between all the different processes going on inside your body and your behaviour in the world. The things you're doing, you're exposing yourself to a book and reading it, right? And what's in that book and the process of reading it will be affecting your thinking. Yes, Russell?
Oh, well, I'm just interested in that part that you just stated there about the world.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, because why setting or context or the external?
Yeah, look, I include the world there in the sense in behaviour. If something is happening in China at the moment, it doesn't affect my consciousness, unless I happen to be on the phone talking to someone getting upset. So it's actually only your interaction with the world which is involved in the formation of your consciousness. It's not the world as a whole. Yeah, so I've just sort of limited that by saying your behaviour.
Right.
But that does include the things I'm looking at, all the things that are producing sensations in me. But for example, something might be burning my hand, but according to what I'm doing at the time, that may mean nothing to me, or it might be a big shock, right? So my behaviour is important, right, rather than simply what's happening in the world, because my behaviour there is my relation to the world. So I'd say that mediating between my conscious and my behaviour is my physiology, my behaviour is consciousness. And so consciousness is a sum total of those subjective processes. Subjective processes means, like conscious, that they're not objective real things. They do stop when you die. Yeah? They're illusions. They might be very good illusions. For instance, when my cat looks in the mirror and thinks he sees another cat, he goes behind the mirror. I know what he's thinking. I know he's acting on an illusion, not a very good one, because he doesn't understand mirrors. But on the other hand, I might see a shadow coming around the corner, and I'll step away from the corner. It's only an illusion, but it turns out to have a good basis, right? So we're all having these illusions that have a good or a poor basis in reality. Okay. We're happy with the story? Yeah? Anyone object? Oh, please. All these things are very controversial. It's very easy to disagree with what I say here, and I'm happy to hear it. Okay, we go on, Behaviour.
False consciousness.
False consciousness. Well, false consciousness is not a very helpful concept. The origin of the concept of false consciousness has come from law. That if someone didn't have sufficient information to understand what was happening to them, or if they were suffering from some mental illness, then they can be said to have had a false consciousness for the point of law, and they can't be blamed for it. But it was only got involved in a political argument in the 70s, really, and there was an issue that feminists accused Marxists of having a theory of false consciousness, and some feminists include each other of believing that women that weren't fighting against patriarchy had a false consciousness. It's really just not a very helpful concept. Yeah? It's not a concept I ever use. If you've got a consciousness, then there's a social basis for that consciousness. Yeah? If you see the world in a certain way, that's not you individually seeing the world that way. There will be a social reason, your social position, your experiences, and it's not helpful to say that's false, because no one can stand outside the world and look down and say this is the truth and what you say is false, right? So I don't take any false consciousness, but I do say, if you're talking about consciousness, what sort of basis does that consciousness have in the material world? It can be a more or less a good one. It's not a cut and dry thing. It's, oh yeah, I can see that, but that's a minor question. That's a pretty thin basis for your opinion. Okay, so you can talk about what basis an idea has in the world, but I don't see the value of lining these up as true and false. Yes?
That's similar to the use of the term reality. Then you need someone to judge.
Yeah. Reality is a loose term, right? It's we sort of generally know what someone means by it, but it's not a word that's used in philosophy, really, because it's so ambiguous. Yeah? And I don't want to try and give a definition of it, because it just leads into conundrums. Yeah?
I just picked it up because you used the term reality.
Right, there you go. Yeah. It explains something, yeah. I'm guilty. I use the term, but it's actually an imprecise term, yes.
In talking about consciousness, there is unconscious.
Unconsciousness. Okay. In this chat, in this tradition of philosophy, whatever, we take consciousness to be the totality of all the subjective processes. We don't have a consciousness and an unconsciousness. See, people talk about conscious awareness, right? That's a specific meaning. But if you say, well, what about the unconscious? Insofar as it exists, it's just part of consciousness, right? Because things that I sort of know unconsciously can pop up in my consciousness and then they can disappear again, right? So the only starting point is to take a category which includes all those subjective processes, and not to start with a category, for instance, which is limited to conscious awareness. Now, if you're into the philosophy of mind, I think that's the problem they get into. They start with conscious awareness as what happens when you wake up, which is a phrase John Searle uses. It's what you get when you wake up and disappears when you go to sleep. That's what I mean by consciousness. Very problematic. Very problematic. I mean, how can you take a criteria like that for such a fundamental concept? So I'm talking about all, because we're taking philosophical foundations on which we want to build a general psychology. As it happens, Vygotsky says that children aren't born with an unconscious. They're an open book in that sense. You build an unconscious over the course of time. Things get put away, filed away. But there isn't a collective unconsciousness via Jung, and nor do your early sexual experiences when you're very, very young get piled away in unconscious either. Unconscious exists, perfectly valid concept. Okay? Behaviour is the purely objective aspect of activity, right? That doesn't make any reference to consciousness. So if I watch someone, I can see their behaviour. I don't have to know what they're thinking. I didn't mean to. I don't care whether you meant to do it or not. That's what you did. That was your behaviour. Right? If my hair stands on end, that's behaviour as well. I didn't mean my hair to stand on end, but it did. Right? So it's purely objective. Now, I've settled on this as a definition of behaviour, because this fellow, John Watson, who's sort of one of the founders of behaviourism, is very good because it gives a very clear definition of behaviourism. So this is just worth reading for a moment. Psychology, as the behaviourist views it, is a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behaviour. Introspection forms no essential part of its methods, nor is the scientific value of its data dependent on the readiness with which they lend themselves to interpretation in terms of consciousness. The behaviourist, in his efforts to get a unitary scheme of animal response, recognises no dividing line between man and brute. The behaviour of man, with all its refinement and complexity, forms only a part of the behaviourist's total scheme of investigation. Okay, so that's not what I'm interested in, right? Control of behaviour. No difference between human being and animal. I'm interested in emancipation and in human freedom. But I thought that behaviourists have got that word, and the idea of behaviourism is like this. There's a black box there, he doesn't know what's inside it, how could you? There's a stimulus in, a reaction out. Right? And that's all behaviourism does. And you had up until... There's a couple of great essays by Noam Chomsky critiquing this idea of Skinner's attempts to build up an entire description of human behaviour that doesn't include consciousness. I mean, this is just insanity, right? To try and understand what people do in all its complexity, if that matter, even in the simplest little thing, without ascribing consciousness to people. The fact is that humans do what humans do through consciousness. It's mediating everything we do. We do this because we had a think about it, we felt this about it, and then we did that, right? But behaviour treats that consciousness as something inside the black box, right? Unseeable, unknowable. Right? The opposite of your phenomenologist that actually starts from that, the direct experience. Subjective psychology, experimental psychology, is a whole bunch of branches of science and philosophy that have begun just with what goes on inside the head being the important thing. But there's problems in that because really you can't see what goes on inside your head. You can't. All you can see is yourself looking at what's going on inside your head. You can't stand outside yourself and look at it. What you can see is someone's behaviour. You can look at your own behaviour with a bit of help from a friend, and you look at other people's behaviour, and basically the job of a psychologist is just like the job of an historian. In a sense, history doesn't exist. It's already gone past. Right? You can never go and see any item of history. But what you can see is the traces it left. And the job of the historian is to reconstruct the history of ancient Rome, the rise of civilization, etc., by the traces it's left behind. And we regard that's a perfectly legitimate branch of inquiry. No physicist has ever seen an atom. Right? But they've seen traces and they've seen evidence of all sorts of kinds that allow them to deduce things about atoms. It's the same with psychology. No one has ever seen a mind. Right? But by observing behaviour, knowing that everything we do is mediated by consciousness, you can piece it together. That's the job of science. To take what evidence you've got, which is always objective, given to you, not an opinion, it's there in the world, and from that you deduce how it came about. In the case of studying human behaviour, you're deducing facts about consciousness. Right? Is this okay? Okay, let's try and move on. Okay, now, this term action is a very important concept for us. We had to clear away some ideas to get to it. But actions are what a person does. I'll use the plural, they are the main units of human life. Okay? Can anyone make a guess or a suggestion, what's the difference between behaviour and action? Or actions? Yes?
Is action a conscious process?
Yes.
Consciously engaged
That's right.
behaviour?
Exactly right. So, actions are a unity of consciousness and behaviour. Right? So, when we study human behaviour, we take it that we're studying human actions or human activity. So we assume that the objective movements, things that are given to us, what we can see with our eyes, are happening in and through the consciousness of the people involved. So an act isn't just a behavioural act. I don't think there's a word for a word for a bit of behaviour. But an act or an action differs from a bit of behaviour because it includes the consciousness. You did it. Now, it's true that the consciousness which went with an action isn't given to you in the same obvious, irrefutable way as the behaviour. That's a problem with science, isn't it? You might have a historical document, you're given that's objective, and you have arguments about what the person was trying to do when they wrote it. But that's a legitimate argument. Yeah, and you can summon up evidence to say, well, so-and-so really didn't want to go to war, and this document was drawn up in an event as an attempt to avoid war, and here's what happened. Now, you can have a school of thought, sort of the historical equivalent of the behaviourist, to say, no, it's all you've got is the document. Don't start ascribing any intentions to the actors there. But it just seems to me you can't do history like that. It's good to be factual, to look at the documents, to take in the evidence, but to try and interpret evidence in history or in psychology without assuming that people's actions are mediated through consciousness, that there isn't just behaviour, that it's conscious activity, is to miss the very nature of human life. Right? So what chat or cultural historical activity theory start from is the analysis of actions. The action is the most fundamental category. We don't start from consciousness. It's problematic because it's only something you can sort of infer from something else. We don't start from behaviour, though evidentially speaking we do start from behaviour. That's the evidence that we've got. But conceptually, our starting point, our simplest concept, is the action. And part of the action, the behaviour, is given to us by observation. The consciousness requires the work of science to try and determine it, but it's only the action, he did that for that reason, or that person wasn't thinking about that when they did this, right? Only at that point, when you form the unity of the behaviour and the consciousness that went with the behaviour, do you have some understanding. And you can say, right, here's a little fact, we'll put that in the book and we'll move on to the next bit. So these actions are the basic units of the science. Yes?
Behaviour that's not an action. So, for example, if
Yes.
for example, Tina did experiment with the birds, and then later on the criticism of that is that the birds are actually doing just behaviours and not an action because birds don't have consciousness. So, is that where a behaviour is not an action?
Yep, you're jumping ahead of me there, but it's right. What's on the next slide? Yep, I'll give you a more precise definition of action, then I can answer your question about when you have actions that, when you have behaviour which is not an action, right? So an action is directed towards an object or a goal which does not coincide to its motive. Right, get your head around that. An action is directed towards a goal which does not coincide with its motive. I've got a little picture there of someone firing a billiard ball. Clearly the billiard player is trying to knock the ball into the hole or something. That's the object or goal of the action. But it's not like he's right into knocking things down holes. That's not what's motivating him. It may be that he's trying to win the game, or you might push the motive back a bit further, but the goal of the action, I'm going to whack this ball into this one and it's going to cannon onto the red one and drop it in the hole, is not what's motivating him. And that's the characteristic of an action, that its motive is not the same as its goal. Okay? The little hyperlink there on action takes you to an elaboration of that idea by A.M. Leontief, who's an activity theorist. Now, the question is then, under what circumstances does the object of an action or possible action coincide with its motive? Stimulus response. If I stick my hand in a flame accidentally, for example, pull it out immediately. There's no more distant agenda to that. I get burnt and my hand gets pulled out. I don't think about it. Consciousness is not involved. It's a stimulus and a reaction. There's no goal to the withdrawal of the hand that's different from the motive, which was get that hand the hell out of the hot stuff. Right? So the problem is that your behaviourist is treating all human activity as if it was directed at its immediate goal, which of course is never ever the case. I mean, hardly ever. It is the case when my hair stands on end. There was no goal to my hair standing on end. It just happened. If someone swings a punch at me and I duck, again, there's no difference between the ducking and the getting out of the way of the punch. They are the same thing. So we do have within us this bundle of reflexes in which consciousness doesn't get involved. They're just the stimulus is directly hardwired into the reaction. Heat, muscles contract. Sometimes you may be born with those reactions, or they may be conditioned. Doesn't matter. Sometimes the reflex is not something you're born with, but it develops to a point. I hear a loud bang, I drop to the ground. Right? Doesn't make sense, but I wasn't thinking about it. Yes.
Are you suggesting that all action that isn't a reaction in that stimulus sort of way is intentional action?
I'm saying that it comes under the heading of action, that it has a motive. Now, the thing is, your motive can be what you might say one you are not consciously aware of. And there's a lot of work to do in the education area of like the child won't do their homework. You say, well, if you do your homework, I'll give you a bar of chocolate. Homework gets done. Now, which is a particularly crude example, of course, but it raises the question of the motive. Was the motive to please the teacher, or was the motive to actually learn from what the homework gave? But clearly there's a difference. But to say, was it intentional? Well, the child's intentions are still in the process of developing. Yeah? They're not yet fully in control of their life. They say, well, I want to be a cabinet minister when I grow up, so I'm going to do this homework. I mean, never heard of, right? The relationship between what a child does and its motives are up for grabs. But what you will have is you must treat their actions as not being reflexes. That consciousness intervenes and there is a motive there. Whether that motive is the motive you wanted them to have, whether it's the motive they think they have, that's all up for grabs. I'm not trying to be a psychologist, but I'm just trying to give you the concept. The concept is that when for example, a child whose intentional structures are not yet fully developed, Cheryl has to go now.
It's not because you didn't.
Yeah, I understand. We were warned before. She has to get to the countryside. She's not running away from a very incisive question there, very challenging question. So I'm emphasising, it's a great illustration of the fact that I'm trying to give you basic concepts here. I can't give you a total psychology. But when you raise the question, well, if an action is something whose immediate goal is not equal to its motive, you're saying every action has some distal motive, that everything we do is intentional in that sense? Well, yes, but the status of that intention, the where it sits in consciousness, how consciously aware you are of it, they're all problems for psychology. Okay? It's probably rarely the case that someone decides to do something, gets in their car or whatever, drives off to do it, thinking this will further my career and allow me world domination or something. Yeah? The relationship, the way that goal serves a motive is the subject for investigation. And there can be motives at different layers. The important thing is to realise that what's motivating someone to do something is not the immediate goal, and if it is, it's not really an action. It's just a reflex. Animals do terrific things when they're trained, when they're given a bunch of reflexes to do things. They don't do it in order to please owner. They just do it, right? They like doing it. They've been so conditioned they like doing this thing. And no other explanation is needed. To the trainer, it's always dangerous, of course, when one starts saying what animals can do and can't do, because they always get faulted. But so I should avoid that. Talking about human beings, humans do things for reasons, they're not necessarily consciously aware of them, but generally speaking, you can't find someone's motive for doing something simply in what they immediately did. What they actually did, their behavioural act, is important, yes.
Wondering, do you see the concept of motive as introducing the cultural context?
Yeah, that's right. The motive comes from culture somehow or other. And that might be one of the reasons that the motive may be quite impenetrable to someone else if you don't share the same cultural assumptions. Why is that person doing it? That's crazy. They're going to get into awful trouble. Say, oh, well, actually, this, that, and the other thing in their culture, this, oh, I see. No wonder they're doing that, yeah? So, and of course, if you ask them, that person may not say, oh, well, our culture says I have to do that. They just think that's what I've got to do. They don't think it
conceptually introduces the culture.
It conceptually, exactly, perfect, yes. Conceptually, that's where the wider culture comes in. That a person isn't just an individual doing something there at that moment. There's a motivation. That motivation comes from an involvement in a wider world, which is a cultural world, the source of motivations. That's a really perfect point. Thank you. That's exactly right.
Can I just ask a quick question? Does there come a point where an action becomes a behaviour if that stimulus response becomes so entrenched it's now like the kind of motive alter?
Yeah, that's an issue that will come up in a couple of weeks' time. If something is an action, for example, when I'm learning to drive a car, I have all sorts of actions I have to do in order to keep the car on the road, not for their own sake, but in order to drive properly. And then 10 years down the track, I have no conscious awareness of them. They're just like a reaction. Someone steps in front of the car, my foot goes on the brake without a second thought. Now, there's actually, that's a different category of thing. It's not the same as a conditioned reflex, because it is actually under conscious control, right? But I have to ask forbearance. We'll come to that in a couple of weeks' time. Okay, but well spotted. Okay, I'm going to click on. Oh yeah, that's right. One thing I wanted to say. I say an action is a prior unity of consciousness and behaviour. There's a philosophical problem here when I say that consciousness is a unity, an action is a unity of consciousness and behaviour. And it's a philosophical problem that's just worth reflecting on, because it's going to come up later. If action is our founding concept, then I can investigate an action, which I'm illustrating with these magnifying glasses, and I can abstract from that action the behaviour and the consciousness. And so when a person is doing something, they don't first have a consciousness and then decide to do it. They're all tied up together. I mean, it may have been like that, but ain't necessarily like that. Right? So in forming the idea of a consciousness, I'm actually abstracting that from actions. Yeah? So I can talk about consciousness, but all that's really there is actions. Yeah? And when I become a psychologist and start imputing to people's actions a consciousness, I'm producing something there from my investigation, my abstraction of the actions. Because we had this intro to sort out the difference between consciousness and matter, mind and matter and those things, so we could get clear on them. But what we're doing here is that we're reconstructing consciousness by a study of action. Right? Because that's how we get to know consciousness, and we're imputing that. We may make a wrong imputation, may fault it, but basically we're constructing consciousness out of a study of actions. Likewise, behaviour is something that the behaviourists do by abstracting away from consciousness, and they're quite explicit about that. If you remember the little section I read from John B. Watson, he says we're not bothered, we don't want to have anything to do with consciousness. We're just locking that out. And if you worked in Pavlov's, famously, if you worked on Pavlov's lab in Moscow, you were not allowed to say anything that imputed the existence of consciousness. Right? Like if you said, oh, that dog's looking unhappy, out, you'd be banned from the lab, right? Because you might say that the dog's mouth is dropping, or his eyes are a bit closed. But if you imputed a thought to the dog, this was non-scientific, I don't know whether you're allowed back in after a week or whatever, but it said you'll be banned. Right? So the behaviourists are very conscious that they're abstracting behaviour away from actions because they don't want to have anything to do with consciousness. They know consciousness is there, but they say if we're going to be scientific, we can't be like historians reconstructing events from the traces left behind. We can't be like geologists who reconstruct the movement of the continents and everything by the traces are left behind. We behaviourists are going to be so bloody scientific that we don't reconstruct anything. We just take what's in front of our noses, right? Which is the kind of thing that gives science a bad name, isn't it? Right? So now the point is that strictly true? And I just want to raise this as a question. Is it possible to have consciousness separately from action? And is it possible to act or to behave without consciousness? Now, we've covered the fact that you can behave without consciousness. It's called a reflex. But is it possible to have consciousness without behaviour? Okay, so I'm suggesting that the action is abstracting from a prior unity, meaning consciousness and behaviour are there together when you first come across them, and you get out your magnifying glass and you say, that's the behaviour, that's the consciousness. But really, they were together in the first place. But that's an assertion which is yet unproved, that it's impossible that you had a consciousness prior to the action. Well, maybe you spent 10 years making plans before you did the action. Okay? So I'm sort of being a bit self-critical here, that we say that an action is a unity of consciousness and behaviour, and in a certain sense we abstract the two away to form separate concepts of them, but it does leave open the question that consciousness can have some separate existence to an action, and that's just something we're going to deal with that later on to think about. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes to reflect on these three concepts which we've gone over today: consciousness, behaviour and actions. Russell, are you convinced, or what at this point do you think consciousness is?
I had two things I was wondering about. One was, and it might be coming later on, and so I'm just wondering where you're going, but why mediation hadn't been mentioned yet.
Mediation was mentioned.
Well, it was mentioned at the start, but I was interested in, if we go back to even that last slide.
Oh, which slide?
The very last slide. You mentioned it with physiology and
yeah, that's right.
consciousness. But that last, slide number 6.
I'll go back and you tell me which side.
No, that when I meant the last slide, I meant slide 6, which was that one.
Why isn't mediation mentioned there?
Well, not so much why isn't it mentioned there, but I think it's a helpful way to go back to Jenny's point.
Right.
It's those cultural artifacts that kind of mediate rather than just jumping back.
Yep.
Maybe. I'm trying to give a concrete example. So, like an animal when it's hungry, it will just attack and eat and satisfy itself. Whereas an action humans might make is, they might wait another 15 minutes until the time appropriate, and they'll go to the ATM and get some money, and they'll go.
Okay.
And I just think, I think that might be. I was just trying to, think of mediation in that way as bringing in all those cultural conventions that we have that stop us just from, biting someone and eating, because we're hungry. Which is what an animal would do when they get hungry.
Yeah. Unless they've been well trained. No, you're quite correct. So what was your name again? Jenny. Jenny picked up the motive which lies behind an action, but is not identical to it, is where culture comes in. The question is how. And that's what Russell is raising. How does culture come in? And in the Vygotskian way of thinking, this raises not just mediation in general, because mediation is a extremely broad term, just means between this and this we have something in the middle. It's artifact mediation, meaning it could be words, it could be objects, it could be money. A lot of it is language, but not exclusively language. And that's how, if it would seem that investigating people's motives and how they achieve their motives is going to be an important part of psychology, and that will involve us looking at the artifacts which mediate the formation of motives. The artifacts covering language and covering all sorts of other perfectly material things, right? And that's important because while we can talk about mediation by concepts or mediation by practices, mediation by artifacts is a very definite thing which you can observe and catalogue and keep track of. And it's about as basic as you can get. So yes, that will come up. It's I don't know, maybe next week, but it's on the list. So we'll look at that.
When Jenny made that point, I thought,
Well, Jenny very insightfully saw the opening that provided, and in a sense took us to a point a couple of weeks down the track, which was great. Good.
Well, I just thought it was important to differentiate intention and motive, and I thought the way to do that is to situate intention in a psychology and motive culturally, maybe. That was one thing that when I went to ISCAR, and Marianne Hildegard was talking about motives quite a lot, and I come from a discursive psychological perspective, and I was saying, well, why is she bringing up this individualistic concept all the time? And so when I hear you talking about motive, that just sort of opened it up a little bit for me.
Yeah, Marianne Hildegard. Yeah, look, the words get used in different theories in different ways. Intention is not used very much in chat. It's just a word that's not used much. It presupposes someone's conscious awareness of the goal that they're trying to achieve, and that's fine. But it's just, I just don't hear people talking about intentions.
Yes.
Motive is not in chat something that's individual. Yes. It's very much something that's culturally and socially located. We acquire motives from our interaction with the world around us. We acquire them. You know, we develop an interest. Interest people use so much.
It may not be obvious to a non-chat insider initially.
That's right. Yeah. And part of the objectives of this course, by starting it really like real sort of basics, abstract things, is to try and sort out what different words mean in this context, because they mean different things in other contexts as well. Okay. Any other issues we want to raise for a minute? Yeah. Behaviour. If you read Vygotsky, he talks about behaviour a lot. His aim is to investigate human behaviour, and it's just that he was writing at the very, very beginning of the development of the science. Later on, the meanings of the word activity and behaviour become specialised. But if you're reading the original work of Vygotsky, he probably uses the word behaviour 10 times for every one time he talks about activity. But we're not living in the 1930s, we're living now, and we can be more precise about what we mean by words.
So with behaviour, is that completely isolated to just physical sort of manifestations of...
Do you want to put up your three concepts that you want us to reflect on?
No, it means that which can be observed. That's historically, because it's been adopted by behaviourism, and their concept of science is that it has to be observable. Now, there are two streams of behaviourism: physiological behaviourism and social behaviourism, that tended to, because logically speaking, there are two kinds of things that we do that can be observed. One is observed by sticking probes on us, and people say, oh, that part of his brain went wild when he looked at that image or something, and you can say that's behaviour. You made the dial spring right over to the red zone when you looked at that scrumptious picture, and so that's what physiological behaviourists get involved in, with the aim of reducing human behaviour to a physiological process, in which really what happens in the outside world is just the conditions. It's not important to study. So you can study the behaviour of a wolf without looking at what makes trees grow, and so on. You're just looking at the organism. And then the social behaviourists that rightly say with some justice that nothing can be gained through physiology. And I have a lot of sympathy with that. I mean, the physiology of the brain is advanced to an unbelievable extent at this moment, but I really don't believe that they've discovered anything worthwhile outside of the operating theatre or the construction of prosthetics, right? People that want to understand human behaviour, other than curing someone that's had brain damage because someone shot them through the head or they got a tumour or something, they do social behaviourism, and it just involves watching people in the supermarket and look, they'll pick out the bright red apples, so let's paint all the apples red and they'll be much happier. That sort of stuff. So they're the two meanings, distinct meanings I can see attached to behaviour, and I'm quite happy to take behaviour as inclusive of both. Yes. It's a process, right? The connection between consciousness and behaviour is a process, and that process is activity. And it's manifested, and it's always an open question what the connection between the way actions are manifested and what went on behind it. It's perfectly sensible in that context to talk about an active consciousness, as to say, if I spent weeks putting these things together, running through these kind of discussions in my head before I came in here, and that was action. You know, I mean, an hour of it I'd be exhausted. Actually, nothing was produced other than ideas in my head, but that was because I had already spoken to the Melbourne Society for Continental Philosophy, got a booking, made a commitment, and that generated my thinking. And so my thinking wasn't just a dream, how I'm going to become Commissar for Education. It was thinking directed towards an act that I was committed to, and it made sense in relation to that development of thought and action. So you have to take them together, and that's why it's activity theory and not consciousness theory. Yes?
Is an action necessarily an interaction?
Yes, it is. Not by definition, right? But what we find is that everything we do is, in some way or another, an action to another person. I discovered a new word in my vocabulary. Have anyone ever heard of tuism? T-U-I-S-M. Tu is, like a French word for you or thou. And there's a word called tuism, which is the theory that language is always directed towards a second person. And that Marx says something like, when I write scientifically, I do so socially because I am a man. In other words, because I'm a human being, therefore everything I do, even sweating over screeds and manuscripts of political economy, is a social act. Because he was aware that in his work he was doing with political economy, its motivation was given by the hell going on in the world and doing something about it. Right? So it is actually the case that every action is an interaction, but it may be a very highly mediated interaction. It may involve 25 years of sweating on a book and then the book being published or not. And that might only be after 25 years of thinking and working on an idea that the social interaction happens. But it was that interaction which was providing the motivation. Yes?
I was just going to say, because that's something that I've been thinking through the whole time that you've been talking about this, that idea of behaviour and trying to extract consciousness from behaviour, because behaviour is purely objective, but of course language isn't. And that's where I think a lot of psychologists, I've had a lot of discussion with colleagues who are psychologists, and whenever you do an observation, in the process of recording that observation, the behaviour is no longer objective, because you choose the language that you use to record that observation.
Yeah, the problem is that it's really a catch-22, isn't it? Because human beings in a normal state of existence are interacting with others. If you invite someone to be a subject for your psychology experiment, you might, for instance, invite a friend who, wants to see you succeed in your work and say, oh yeah, I'll be your subject if you like, what you want me to do. So no matter how much, or I don't know what their motivation might be, but the thing is that they're motivated. It might be to earn money, to cause some difficulty, to give you some responses, that they're going to have a good laugh thinking how you're going to fit them onto the graph, or whatever. The normal condition of human beings is interacting. Therefore, it's a mistake to try and make an experiment such that it's objective. Really, that's going the way of the behaviourists. What you need to do is to say, I'm a researcher, I'm involved with this person, and I'm going to include everything I do in the data. Yeah? And then the interaction between the subject and me is part of the data. So, oh look, here I did so-and-so, I only heard that word. So you need objective data, yes, so people are using video cameras and all sorts of things to try and preserve the data, but whatever you do, it is an interaction. And one of the things you'll find in all the research that's done by people in chat is that they don't make that effort to try and pretend that something's objective. Like locking children in a room and then watching what happens to them when they're separated from their parents. I mean, chat researchers are always involved in interactions, and the interactions they make themselves part of their research. And for example, if you do an interaction with a child that leads to some breakthrough in the child's development, then that's a gain for research. Okay, it leaves it up the issue, how can someone else reproduce what you did? But better to make a contribution to research than to have something nice and objective, yes.